Good morning. I'm Peter Kovacs. I'm the editor of The Advocate and the Times-Picayune, and welcome to our 2021 State Economic Outlook Forum. Let me start off by introducing my co-host, our managing editor, Fred Kambach.
Good morning.
And also before we start, I should thank our sponsors, LCMC Health and Entergy. And also we'll begin with a brief message from one of our sponsors.
What does it mean to be wealthy? At LCMC Health, we measure wealth not with commas, but with compassion. Because it's the little extras that truly enrich the lives of our patients.
Great. Let's get started. A year ago, we gathered in the Manship Theater for an optimistic conversation about a new year and a new decade. Well, things didn't work out like we planned. When we met, the unemployment rate in Louisiana was 5.7%. Soon enough, it reached 14%, and even with all the reopening since then, it's still stubbornly high at 8%. At the bottom, we lost nearly 250,000 jobs, and even today, only 3/4 of those jobs have come back. While we can't gather in person quite yet, this panel is taking place at a time of more optimism as vaccines are rolling out and there's new hope that things will get back to normal sometime in 2021. But the problems we discussed a year ago at the Manship Theater are still with us. An economy too dependent on tourism and energy, the plague of inequality and all it carries with it. The events of 2020 made all that seem more vivid and more troubling. Most of the lost jobs are low wage, so the poor have suffered the most, a familiar problem in Louisiana. But a new year brings a fresh start, so let's hear from our panelists about what they see ahead, and we'll start, as we have in the past, with Don Pearson, the Secretary of Economic Development for the state of Louisiana.
Good morning. And thank you to Entergy and LCMC for giving us the opportunity to partner with the Advocate and speak to all our stakeholders across Louisiana. We are very much cautiously optimistic about the statewide economic condition for 2021. And over the course of the next hour, we'll talk in various lanes to discuss that relative to the sectors that are out there that drive our economy. The backdrop, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic that we're fighting. The president putting us on a war footing. We're going to need to be successful there because the ramifications will ripple across our economy. The success of the vaccine program is key to that. And we do have the logistics in place to get those shots in arms necessary. But as you know, there's currently a supply deficit coming into the state to help us move in that direction. So there's some factors such as that will continue to impact the economy and sort of make it difficult for us to get to all the projections as clearly as we'd like to. What I can tell you is that we have 130,000 manufacturing jobs in this state at this time. And there's a tremendous multiplier effect around that. Our agriculture, our timber sectors are doing well. Our ports, our logistics continue to do well. So while we are up against these headwinds, we still maintain a lot of economic strength that we can build on, grow on, and we'll talk more about that again over the next hour. Critical is also sort of when United States consumer confidence returns, because that's when people will resume leisure travel. That's so important to our Southeast Louisiana market and several other markets in our state that are driven by tourism and hospitality. We want those cruise ships cruising. We want to get the business conventions back in our state. Those are big drivers for us and help build that diverse array of jobs that we need to power the economy. Certainly there's going to be a shifting in supply chains Certainly, new elements in energy strategies are going to play a role here. What we get from the federal government, how robust the response is in terms of stimulus checks, in terms of SBA and PPP programs, powering our small businesses that have been impacted. The very difficult challenges we have in Southwest Louisiana to completely rebuild that part of the state. But please know, those are our goals, to build a stronger Louisiana economy. And we have a comprehensive game plan to do that. We understand clearly that there's strengthening of hurricane and flood protection that needs to take place. And certainly, as it was mentioned, quality of life, equity for every Louisiana family, and stronger economic opportunity for everyone will be very high on our list of strategic priorities going forward. We are optimistic about the future of Louisiana.
Oh, thank you very much. Next up is Philip May, President and CEO of Entergy Louisiana.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for Advocate for bringing us together for this critical topic for our state and our communities. You know, we all know 2020 was an extremely challenging year, and we bring many of those challenges with us into 2021. However, I believe that if we all work together, we can ensure a bright future for our state. You know, focusing on Entergy Louisiana, there are three areas that we're excited to be working towards for the long term. First, transforming our generating fleet. It's already one of the cleanest in the country, and we're working to make it even cleaner. We're also going to be strengthening and improving the last mile of our electric system by investing in new materials and new technologies. And while we're doing that, we're going to be complementing electric and gas service in a way that provides solutions to our customers and helps them achieve their aspirations. Now, foundationally, we'll remain committed to providing clean, safe, reliable, and affordable power. We also remain committed to fueling economic growth. You know, as Don talked about, over the past decade, the state's been very, very fortunate in terms of economic growth, and Entergy Louisiana has participated in economic development projects throughout the state that total more than $100 billion. Our business and economic development teams continue to work with our state and regional partners to attract new business and industry while working to keep and expand our existing businesses right here in our local communities. It's because of strong partnerships that today Louisiana has 122 certified sites ready for businesses to build and contribute to creating a more vibrant economy. We know that they will need a resilient power grid, and they'll also need an energy provider they can depend on. That's why we're continuing to upgrade our infrastructure and systems with a focus on efficiency, resiliency, reliability, and environmental stewardship. You know, last September, we committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. As part of that effort, we're continuing to invest in our existing nuclear facilities, which are the state's largest source of emission-free power, while adding renewables like solar. Last year, we began purchasing power from the state's largest solar facility and announced our intention to add more. We're proud to be part of the state's Climate Initiative Task Force, which is exploring initiatives like wind power, and we're part of the Gulf Coast Carbon Collaborative. As we continue to lower our emission rate, we're partnering with our customers to help them do the same. And we deploy new technologies. We're offering new tools that make doing business with us easier and help our customers save money. This year, we'll complete the rollout of our new advanced infrastructure, which includes digital meters. That infrastructure is the foundation for a smarter energy future. Some of the benefits, like detecting outages faster and providing detailed energy usage data that provide customers more information and help them save money. It's an exciting time for our industry as new technologies and sound policies are helping to bring solutions to our customers and better our world. Louisiana is our home, and we want to see it thrive. I know that together we can see that it does. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Now we go to Greg Bowser, who's president of the Louisiana Chemical Association.
Thank you very much. You know, it's good to be here. A year ago, as you mentioned, we were talking about this and we were looking at different things, and a lot of things happened that none of us anticipated. Well, for the chemical industry as a whole, in late 2019, we saw a little bit of a slowdown going into 2020. And then in March of 2020, when the pandemic hit, it really slowed things down for us. We saw some good things and some bad. First of all, the bad. We had some folks that people stopped traveling, people stopped moving around. That created issues for us as an industry, well, from a global perspective. The other thing that happened was that we had a couple of hurricanes that hit in the western part of our state, southwest Louisiana. That just created additional issues for us with respect to not just the facilities themselves being damaged, but our employees being displaced. So that all of a sudden slowed down the production of in our industry in Louisiana. I'm happy to say that we're recovering from that. We're moving forward. We have some facilities that are still recovering. It may be probably early 2022 that some of them come back online, but we will continue to work forward in that regard. Going forward, looking at what the industry holds for Louisiana going forward, I think we have an excellent opportunity to get some really big projects into Louisiana. We have to be competitive. You heard Philip mention about energy, some of our energy costs that they're working to reduce. All of that goes into making us competitive. One of the things that's going to be we're going to face when we come out of this new normal, whatever that may be, is that we have to be more competitive, because other states are going to be very, very competitive for expansions and for things like that. We have the opportunity in Louisiana to really do some things and to go forward. And what we're doing here, especially in our industries, we're looking forward as well in terms of technology. We're looking forward in terms of things like we're participating in the climate change task force that the governor has appointed. We look forward to that because many of our industries are really doing some things that's ahead of the curve with respect to climate change and emissions. And so we look forward to sharing those ideas as we move forward this year. And hopefully we can continue to grow. We think that probably our industry will start to see a substantial growth in the latter part of 2021, early 2022. But in the interim, we have to continue to build back and make things a little bit better than they were before. But we have some excellent opportunities, and we look forward to working with all of our partners in doing that and the state.
Okay, thank you very much. T. Martin is the co-proprietor of Commander's Palace and has the most distinctive paint job of anyone on our panel.
Thanks, Peter. I was kind of wondering how I ended up on this panel with all these smart gentlemen like the secretary that I know and all these smart oil and chemical guys. And then I was remembering a festival that always fascinated me when I was growing up here in Louisiana called the Shrimp and Petroleum Festival. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, maybe there is some connection that I'm not seeing. Anyway, to give you a state of our world and our industry, couple little things. I have spent my career trying to cause interaction between our team and our guests. Well, now we spend all our time trying to limit interaction between our guests and our employees. My valet does not park your car. He now takes your temperature. Anyway, these are just some things that, I have to laugh because if not, I'm going to cry. And we've done a lot of pivots in our business, as have, so many of the restaurants in town. I mean, we started to-go food with our little spot next door now called the Petite Blue. We do this crazy Zoom on Wednesdays that we do this wine and cheese pairing nationally. We ship food nationally on something called goldbelly.com. We're from Mardi Gras, we're doing a house float going up tomorrow. So we're trying everything that we can, but my sales this month are 26% of what they were in January of last year. So my sales are drastically down and my costs are up, and there's a lot of business people on the phone, and you understand that this is a really bad formula. 79% of operators in the country report down sales, which means there are some that are up. I mean, you all can think about fast food, and there are some places in the country where it seems that they feel like there is no virus and they're operating without restrictions. But 87% of independent restaurants report sales down drastically. So, and 54% of Louisiana restaurant operators think sales will decrease further in the next 3 months. 30% of Louisiana restaurant operators think they will not make it 6 more months. So I know Peter wanted us to be more positive, and I think when we get to the end of this, we will. But this is as stark as it's been. I think a lot of people had a little uptick over the holidays, and now, at least in New Orleans, our occupancy is allowed only at 25%. I think we all understand that a large percentage of the city's budget comes, from our industry. And one of the top reasons people have always said they come to New Orleans is for food. So we've got to keep this industry going. The things we need, I think Don and the rest of the gentlemen have already explained. The vaccine cannot come fast enough. We need that confidence for people to come back out to restaurants in general. And we want you to know that restaurants have always been pretty safe. We've always had lots of regulations and had to operate in these ways. And I think an awful lot of operators are doing extremely well at that. I personally would like a little more enforcement. This next round of PPP cannot get distributed fast enough. There should really be an industry-specific fund. Why is the airline industry being bailed out and not the restaurant industry? I'll take some guesses as to that. But there's something called the Restaurants Act, which could act in that way. We would love to see that pass, and it really helps the smaller restaurants. And good Lord, that is the preponderance of jobs are in these smaller businesses, as we know. And in New Orleans, we need a comprehensive plan for the city to rebound in the hospitality industry. We did this after Katrina. I have the study right here in my very busy office. And it worked. And we need that again, and we need it soon. And the other thing, I personally hope we'll do is our industry never tried to become one of the major industries of the city. We'd like it to be more balanced. And to that end, I hope we support entrepreneurship an awful lot more in the city. I do think when this thing is over, there's going to be some pent up demand, and I'm hopeful that it might be Katie bar the doors. But between here and there, we are going to lose a lot of darn good restaurants. And we have led the country in food for hundreds of years, and we don't intend to stop now. But we're going to need some help there.
Thank you very much. We have David Dismukes, who's the Executive Director and Professor at the LSU Center for Energy Studies. You're muted.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. As many people in South Louisiana understand, the pandemic has leveled a pretty significant blow to the energy business in this state and throughout the United States and really globally. There's been very few sectors within the energy industry that have not been touched in one way or another by this pandemic, some more so than others. It doesn't matter if you're in the upstream part of the business, in the exploration and production end, whether you're in processing or transportation, even down, as you heard from Philip earlier, into the power generation. In retail sectors, we've seen significant changes over the last year. We are starting to see some recovery in the energy industry right now. But we've got a long way to go before we can even get back to where we were prior to the recession, much less to where we were projected to be when we were talking earlier in January of this year. If you look at our production numbers, for instance, in January or February, the U.S. was peaking out around 13 million barrels of oil production, which was a peak a day, 13 million a day. We're down around 11 right now. Natural gas was over 110 billion cubic feet a day. We're down around 8 to 80 today. We're seeing numbers anywhere from 15 to 17% down, depending on which ones you're looking at, which ones you're measuring. Prices have obviously collapsed in most of these sectors. We've seen some rebounds from the low 30s or even negative numbers in March and April of this year, moving back up to $51 today. Natural gas is somewhere around the $2.50 mark. So while we have seen some improvement, drilling rigs are slightly up. We've probably hit the bottom on drilling activity in terms of the contraction. But again, we have a long way to go before we get back to where we were before. When you think about the future, there's going to be two things that impact the energy business. One is going to be the economic recovery associated with the pandemic. The faster that is and the more evenly distributed that recovery is, the better off the energy sector will be. That will put pressure on energy demand. That will put pressure on prices. It'll bring suppliers back into the market. It'll start drilling activity and a host of other investment opportunities. The slower that growth is, the more uneven that growth is, the less likely we're going to see a lot more investment and a lot more changes and a lot more growth in the sector. The other thing that I think is going to be equally important, if not more so important, is going to be changes in public policy. And I think that's gotten driven home by some of the news that we have all seen in the last 24 hours alone with the new administration. We've seen the cancellation of the XL pipeline, and more recently yesterday, the announcement of a suspension of activities on federal leases, both offshore and onshore, in the United States for drilling activity, which is going to have impacts for a lot of our producers in this area, as well as just domestically overall. And workers here in Louisiana that work all over the country and are mobile are going to be impacted by this as well. So it's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to these questions and the discussions we have in a little bit.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go to Fred for the first round of questions.
Sure. This first question is for Don. You mentioned supply chain issues when you spoke a little bit earlier, and they tend to cause shortage problems. I think that's been an experience here. What kind of opportunities might Louisiana have if manufacturers decide to move back onshore here in the United States?
That's a great point, and certainly it's one that's very dynamic on our radar screen right now. That there's tremendous opportunities in, say, PPE production, certain pharmaceutical production, and we are in the midst of those conversations. And I'm pleased to report to you that we may have some nice announcements around some of those types of activities in the very near future. But these global supply chains, there has been a lot of introspection in boardrooms in these Fortune 500 companies across America about being dependent on key elements of their products, services coming in from overseas. And so looking at more U.S. production is high on the list for a lot of these companies. We are having those conversations. We are redoubling our efforts with the site consultants that guide a lot of these projects. And actually, we are very busy and very engaged at the present time.
Thank you. I got a question now for David. Will remote working create a permanent decline in auto travel, and how are energy companies factoring that into their projections for the coming couple of years?
So that's a good question, and I don't know is the answer. I don't think any of us probably know right now. And it's just going to depend on how the recovery plays itself out and how much of this is transitory in nature and how much of it's permanent. And trust me, this is a big issue with energy companies, a big issue with academics, a big issue trying to understand, is this a transition thing that we're dealing with right now, or we're going to start seeing a permanent change in how workers go to work and how we interact with one another, et cetera. My guess is it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. And yes, it's going to have a very big, significant impact on travel. It's going to have a big impact on liquid fuel demand. You take that and you couple that with public policy changes that are looking to fuel switch anyway into electric vehicles and other things. It doesn't bode well for a lot of our traditional refining industries here. It's going to make it a lot more challenging. And I think the thing that Greg talked about earlier is going to be really, really important. And that is this industry is going to get more and more competitive. This is just another form of competition that you see that goes beyond just competing between locations and competing within companies, but competing for fuel mixes and in-use fuel uses. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have a strong answer for you right now.
I think playing off that question a little bit, I have a question for Philip, which is, presumably we're heading in under the new administration to an era that, where government policy pushes electric vehicles. How much does that bend the demand curve for electricity?
Yeah, so obviously it's going to be helpful in terms of demand for electricity. Of course, it depends on the adoption rate and so forth. I think that it's going to take some time for that to happen, but we're talking about an average customer in Louisiana might use 15,000 kilowatt hours a year. Maybe we're adding 500. So it's substantial, but it is highly dependent upon how many customers, what the adoption rate is, and so forth. The big challenge here really is having the infrastructure in place that people can charge their cars. And I know in New Orleans, having a parking place, a lot of people have off-street parking, so that's going to be a challenge of where they charge their car and so forth. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. I think that we're going to have policies in place that encourage that infrastructure build out to really have wide adoption of that. The other thing that I would note, if you look at the South and in the West, people drive a lot more miles than they do in the Northeast and in California. And so, electric cars are going to have to improve in terms of range to make that your utility car, the one that you use every day. Otherwise, I think when people go on vacations and so forth, they may be still using that big SUV that continues to use gasoline.
Sure. Tia, I have a question for you here. Speaking for your restaurant in particular and for the industry in general, when do you see dining habits returning to pre-pandemic levels? That's a big question.
I mean, I think it's when the public feels safe again. So you tell me and we'll both know. Now, I think it's a little bifurcated. I mean, I think there's some people that are just going to run out, when they feel safe, and others, a lot of us think it's going to be a couple of years before some people go out as regularly as they did before.
Greg, I have a question for you here, and this is specific. I'm going to mention Exxon just because they are proposing a capital investment here based on the idea that more of its energy supply will come from Texas by pipeline rather than from abroad up the river. Does this mean our advantage in Baton Rouge, especially in this area, from being on the river may be a thing of the past if everybody's looking toward Texas now for their supply?
It could be, Nat. It depends on what we do. For example, the $240 million investment Exxon's trying to do to its facility will help them to be competitive within their company and will allow them to get some of this stuff and to keep some people employed here in Baton Rouge. That's going to be the big thing. The other thing is going to be cost and what happens with our transportation cost on the river. Not necessarily for stuff that comes by pipeline, but whatever they ship it by barge and things like that, and tankers. So that's going to be an issue. But I think we can still be competitive if they're allowed to do the updates and the modernizations that they're talking about doing to allow them to be somewhat competitive with their sister plants. And I think it's one of the things we're going to see going into the future. We talked about competitiveness. There's going to be a great deal of competitiveness within companies from one facility to the next. And when you're an integrated facility like the ExxonMobil facility out there, that makes a big difference on your cost. So you've got to allow them to be competitive and to modernize.
All right, I'll kick it over to Peter now for the next round of questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let's start this time with Philip. In terms of the way we produce electricity, presumably the Biden administration will be pushing for more green energy, maybe not a Green New Deal, or maybe policies that are like the Green New Deal, but they don't want to call the Green New Deal. It used to be that green energy was more costly, meaning that if you were a consumer of energy, you weren't necessarily a beneficiary of these policies. That's probably not as true as it used to be, but to what degree is it still true? And in terms of projecting forward, will it be true in 5 years?
Yeah, and it's a great question. What we're seeing currently is the price of solar has dropped pretty dramatically over the past decade, and it's to a point where it's very attractive. That's why we added the largest solar facility in the state, which is on the west bank of Baton Rouge, as part of our portfolio, and we're going to continue to add solar as we go forward. I mentioned that we were going to go to net zero by 2050. That's going to require technology that's not yet in place. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is, well, solar can provide relatively economic energy. It's not available at night. So you're going to have to think through what are those things that we can do to make zero emission energy available when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining. Nuclear is a big part of that. About 94% of the emission-free energy that's available in the state comes from our two nuclear plants, Waterford 3 and River Bend. So that's part of the solution. But in terms of where this is going, we're going to have to get there with technology that is currently not in use, and in some degree, technology that does not exist. The good news is Entergy Louisiana already has one of the cleanest portfolios in the country, and every day we're making that cleaner. It used to be a great attribute, but it wasn't absolutely necessary. I think that, in talking about how our businesses and the chemicals and industries and so forth have to become more competitive, they're also going to be focused on what their carbon footprint is, what their emissions are. And I know that those industries have done a really good job of reducing those emissions over the years. Our clean portfolio can help them do more. A good example of that is we partnered with Edison West to make shore power available. So it's a dramatic decrease in the emissions from that fleet as a result of making shore power available. But it's not just that, it's also that it cleans the air locally. And so it makes the communities better as a result of that. We believe we have a portfolio that is able to go forward competitively. We have a plan to get us there, but ultimately to meet some of the goals that the Biden administration has, we're going to need new technologies. Some of those technologies don't exist today.
Yeah. Just as a follow to that, because you said something that had not occurred to me, which is that does this portend a return to construction of nuclear plants, which I guess we probably haven't built a nuclear plant in a generation? And will this policy lead us there? And one of the things that, as I recall, sort of killed off nuclear plant construction was the relative cost of it. But obviously, the cost of everything has changed in a generation. Is it theoretically true that nuclear plants would be cheap energy as they were once going to be, 70 years ago or whatever?
Yeah, so right now the Southern Company is under construction for a nuclear plant. They've been at that for about 10 years, and it's expected to come on either later this year or beginning in 22. The challenge is those projects are not only very expensive, as you mentioned, in that long construction time, the world is a very different place when that unit comes online than when you plan for that unit. Because you think about that, if it takes that long to construct, you back up from there for planning, permitting, getting all of the approvals in place and so forth. With the changes we see, the pace of change we see in this industry right now, I think new nuclear is very challenged, number one, because of cost, but also because of uncertainty for that long period of time it takes. The other part of this is storage technologies are improving all the time. They're not quite economic yet, but they're getting better every day. Solar power, which 10 years ago was an expensive luxury, is now very competitive. So I don't know that I see new nuclear plants, or at least the technology we've used, as the solution in the near term. Longer term, I think research is going to have to go into these modular, safer nuclear units that would be able to provide round-the-clock, 24/7 power. I just don't see that in the near term, because we're talking about taking on an enormous amount of risk for a product that is still very expensive to build.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's go to T. Martin, and the next question is, one of the challenges I hope your prediction comes true, and eventually there's a rush of people returning to New Orleans, to restaurants, to Carnival, to everything else, to Fall Jazz Fest. But it seems like one of the challenges for your business would be that you'd have to rebuild your workforce. And I don't know what your personal experience was, but a closed restaurant probably doesn't employ anyone, or it employs a handful of key people. And over this long a period of time, the workforce scatters, or people find other work to do. And so how will you and the industry handle that challenge? And what's been your experience so far?
Interesting question, and it was surprising, I think, to all of us. As you know, there was some health, and folks were getting checks from the government, and we all assumed that when that ended, they'd all run back to work. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of them did, but a lot of us had trouble staffing the restaurants. And what we all found was that a lot of people left our industry. We've always been a great place to come, and you're in school studying to be a lawyer or a doctor, or you want to own your own restaurant, whatever. But some of those folks went off and did those other things, because they were sort of forced into it or had the time. So it's going to be really, really tough. Fortunately, here in New Orleans, just one of the many things we needed to do. We got started a couple of years ago when we opened NOKI, New Orleans Culinary and Hospitality Institute, and that will be one of the things that we need to do to help attract and build and recruit. But we're going to have to be recruiting from other industries. And I think there's a lot of changes that our industry needed to look inward and took this time to do, because it's a tremendous industry where I always say there's no limits in our industry. And I certainly bristle at the talk of all the jobs being low paying. There certainly are, like there are in most industry, but there's a lot of jobs. You can walk in the door of our restaurant here, and 6 months later, you can be making $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. So there's also a lot of very good jobs, but it's going to be tough. We have lost people.
What is I know there was a lot of complaint from businesses, particularly hospitality businesses, about the $600 augmentation, causing people to be incentivized not to work. I don't know. Now, I guess we're at a $300 augmentation, but the proposal is to go to a $400. How does that interplay right now, when I guess for one thing, you probably aren't in a position to bring your full staff level back?
Right. We certainly can't bring back the full staff when we're only allowed to occupy 25% of the restaurant. But I just, as a human and citizen, am happy for folks to have that help. I mean, when it got to such a high level, it certainly was a disincentive. I mean, there were people who, chose to not work. But that wasn't a high percentage for us, but some folks did that. And our timing kind of worked out. We were closed for 6 months. We closed in March. We reopened in September, and, hoped to get a little traction through the holidays. And that did happen. So, but yeah, it's tough. We want people to want to come back to work, but we know an awful lot of people are not going to open those restaurants, and those jobs aren't going to be there. And that help is needed. And I certainly support that.
Okay, let's go to Don Pearson. Louisiana has a historic problem of not enough young people going to junior colleges and learning trades versus going to colleges and even grad schools and earning degrees in fields that are oversupplied. How do we recalibrate that?
Well, it runs the full gamut. Obviously, a critically important element for our state, workforce development, and we are 11 years serving as the best in the nation with our Fast Start program. We get this, we understand this, and that's why we've run these very strong partnerships with our community colleges, with our four-year universities, and at the same time having some very robust conversations with industry, so that in those community colleges, we are producing graduates with a certificate that walks out, and whether they need to be in welding or computer programming or what have you, we have that just-in-time inventory that we can create. Nothing speaks louder than the market. These young people will see that these certificates allow them to step into well-paying jobs, and from there, we will gain momentum. We are doing that currently. It would make a great story. One of the things that we're doing is putting 5-axis machining equipment on every one of our community college campuses. Those folks that will graduate with that certificate will step into probably a $70,000 to $75,000 a year job. So, and it doesn't just start, again, it's the entire spectrum. It's early childhood education. It's our K-12, sorting out what kind of career path would you like to follow, understanding the importance of manufacturing and what I'll call get your hands dirty jobs that are very appealing to a lot of people and very rewarding, very necessary, and pay a good wage scale. It's certainly something that we've seen Governor Edwards invest in, working closely with all of these education systems, and understanding how critically important it is to produce the workforce. And that's the number one role, to keep our young people here in Louisiana, to keep our talent here in Louisiana, to recruit talent into Louisiana, is to have these industries that need these high-skilled workers and have a pathway to achieve that skill level and reap those rewards.
Okay.
Peter, if I could add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I absolutely concur with all that Don has said. I'll note two things. One is, in Louisiana, we also have dual enrollment programs that allow folks in high school to take programs at universities and community colleges. And the uptake that on for going to traditional universities and so forth is pretty good. We do need to improve the uptake and folks going to getting certifications while they're in high school. That allows them to transition right from high school into good paying jobs, or be more prepared to go into those technical colleges and so forth. The other thing I'll mention is we're going to need financial aid for adult learners. And the challenge there is if we transition away from perhaps other industries to where there are some skilled jobs available, it's going to be very difficult for someone to pay for tuition, pay for the cost of living and maintaining themselves while going to school while they're not working. So that financial aid, I think, is a critical element of retraining and retooling our workforce.
On that subject, as a follow-up question, one of the things that we hear from readers is that the idea of forgiving student loans, which I think is part of the Biden plan, takes us in the wrong direction for this by encouraging students to go into fields of study without an eye toward getting jobs. And if you forgive loans for people who've already done that, you theoretically create an environment in which the next generation of students thinks that they're just going to get their loans forgiven too, so they can study what they're passionate about and not necessarily what would get them a job. Is that, and I guess I would ask Don that, is that your view that loan forgiveness takes us in the wrong direction on this?
This is not an issue that I've actually studied, but what I would tell you is that what we've seen in instances such as after World War II, Vietnam, Desert Storm, that the soldiers, sailors, Marines come home with GI Bill, go to school, get help from the government to transition into productive members of society that become tax-paying citizens. So I really can't speak to the pathway that's best for that to happen, but that's certainly what powers our economy. And the government of Louisiana, investing in our four-year universities and our technical college systems, is doing that with taxpayer funds because we recognize that importance. The rest is fiscal policy. What's important is to have a highly skilled workforce.
Okay.
Again, I'd like to add to that if I could. Look, I agree with all you said, Don. One of the things that in Louisiana is we have relied on TOPS as an offset for tuition. So tuition continues to rise, and we're using TOPS to partially offset that. The problem with that is if you don't take advantage of the TOPS program right when you leave high school, or it's not available to you, college can be very expensive. So I think the fundamental issue we have to deal with is trying to make college education, technical education, or our community colleges more available to people, make it more affordable. And that's going to require that the state put more money and funding into those programs.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me go to David with this question. What is the significance of the closing of the Convent refinery beyond the loss of jobs? And is it telling us something about other refineries and that industry?
Yeah, I think it's telling us a lot of things. One, the industry is changing a lot. I think this pandemic has probably accelerated some of the changes that we've been seeing in the industry by at least 5 years. I think some of the actions that we're already seeing right now in the new administration is going to go further in raising challenges in some of our traditional sectors. It underscores that issue that Greg talked about, is the competitiveness of facilities. This is not an ancient facility. It is on par, and it's at a scale and size that is comparable to a lot of other refineries in the Gulf South region. If this were a refinery that were up in the upper Midwest or on the Atlantic seaboard where we've seen a lot of them, this would be kind of a not unexpected kind of event. To have this down in an area where you have some of the most efficient forward and backward linked refineries in the world, it is very important. It does say a lot, and it says a lot for the remaining base that we have here. That's why continuing to make investments in our facilities and upgrading them and making them more efficient and more profitable is really, really important, because firms compete not only between themselves, but within their particular sectors for firms as well. Exxon in Baton Rouge competes with Exxon in Baytown and all the other assets everywhere else. And anybody that works in the corporate world knows that. And that is only get more intense, not less intense. We have all kinds of other competitive pressures that arise in this industry. And this just kind of exacerbates this and drives home just how competitive things are getting in this industry, and things that we need to think about on a forward-going basis and not taking things for granted. There's, I think too often in Louisiana, a presumption that these industries have been here for a long time. They're not going anywhere. We don't need to really worry about these kinds of things in terms of, our tax breaks, et cetera. And that couldn't be the first thing from the truth right now.
Peter,
I was about to say, I bet Greg has some thoughts.
Yeah, and David touched on it, that the competitiveness within companies is going to be unbelievable, as well as within states. You take that refinery, for example. I mean, you have everything. You have the river, you have a dock, you have everything you would need, and yet still, it closed. It shifted because of market pressures and because of things that competitiveness within that company. That refinery was on the market for about a year or two, and there were no takers. And so people are not, going to just jump on that. Once one closes, it creates a very, very hard, very, very big hardship, not just for us as an industry, but for a community. That community lost 700 jobs, and they lost their largest taxpayer in the parish. All of that goes into it. It just tends to snowball. I think you're going to see some other effects from that. We're hoping that we can minimize it and get some of these people trained to do something else. We were talking about training. The biggest factor there is going to be, and Philip touched on it, is what do you do with somebody who's working, loses their job, and then has to be retrained? They can't take time out to go get training because they have a family to support in many cases, and they have things to go. So that's going to have to be figured out. That's not going to be part of the student loan forgiveness, but that's going to be a financial part that has to be dealt with. Some of our companies, for example, we pay for training. We pay them while they're training, so that helps out. But not all companies can do that, and that's going to be a big deal. But the competitiveness, I think, is going to be the big word going forward, because these companies are going to make adjustments because of the pandemic. People are working differently. I know in chemical plants today, I used to spend most of my year traveling around visiting plants. It's very hard to do that now because they don't have people there. They're restricting access, and so all of that stuff's going to play into it. People are going to, they're not going to be going to the office anymore. Office is going to be at home.
Okay. Critical element here too, what we want to really keep in mind is around modernization. These plants don't stay static. They're in global competition. There's new technology. They're calculating, can they invest in it, improve their ROI, but over the long term, keep their plant viable in the economy. So we are certainly supporting a lot of modernization across the state. It's critical. Sometimes in our business, we get asked about, well, what about net new jobs? Today, if you can retain the workforce that you have associated with these plants, very sophisticated workers that are doing very complex and often dangerous jobs, that's critically important. And we started off by saying that a lot of folks would take it for granted. That plant's always been there. That plant's always going to be there. I think what happened in Convent is clear evidence that that's not the case. And the governor is very supportive, and certainly the department is very supportive of these modernizations that retain the workforce and position our state for future success in an arena that basically we dominate with technology, with the sophisticated workforce that we have, and with our raw products that through pipelines are readily available to us.
Okay. And Peter, there's one other thing I think to think about in terms of capital investment and continued investment here in Louisiana in this competitive issue on a forward-going basis, and that is most of your publicly traded chemical companies right now have cut capital expenditures from anywhere from 15 to 30% relative to 2019 levels. And 2019 levels were below where they were about in the year before, which were the higher levels. In the oil and gas business, you're looking at numbers that are 60% where they were in 2019 alone. And most estimates are that those CapEx numbers will not return to 2019 levels alone until 2025. The point being is that for every capital dollar that goes into making an investment somewhere, whether it's modernization or a greenfield facility or something else, you're going to have to fight harder and harder and harder for that dollar, because it is not the same environment that we were in back in 2019 and earlier.
Okay, thank you. I think if we could go turn it over to Fred, and we'll go through one more round of questions.
Sure. I'll shift gears a little bit here. Tia had a question for you, and that is, will the Paycheck Protection Loan forgiveness, do you see that being an issue, especially for small business in the coming year?
I think that's going to be the only thing that's going to help a lot of folks survive. And it's better set up than the first one. The first one was a nightmare in that its intent was to help you for 8 to 12 weeks. Well, y'all understand that we needed a little more help than that. And
Right.
it was hell to get it. And anyway, so and very specific, I do think this particular program, look, 2 weeks ago we were being told, maybe don't apply right away. There's some other things you could do first. And then all of a sudden, literally yesterday, we all got the word, hurry up and apply. The money's going to run out. And then I know I personally was, whatever, spent hours on it yesterday. So it's just this, constant nightmare. It's a financial bloodbath, and folks need that help. I do think if they get it out and get it out quick, it's really going to be a big part of a percentage, a chunk of people making it through this that would not have.
Continuing our focus on small business for a minute. Don, what's the main concern you've heard from small businesses going forward under the new administration and into COVID, either one?
With small businesses, it's just been a struggle on all fronts. They're impacted by COVID. Many of them have been impacted by this robust storm season. It's challenging to move through the administrative segments of SBA, economic disaster injury loans, and the payroll protection programs. There's a lot to understand and a lot of frustration that builds up around these things. So we're doing all we can to connect small business development centers that are around our state with SBA and federal resources. Certainly from an LED perspective, our website, opportunitylouisiana.com, can help companies transition that have not had a digital storefront. I think a lot of small businesses never thought that they would need to be available online to their clients, but you're seeing that digital transition in retail sales and services that likely isn't going to change back. So it's a time of having to endure a shattered marketplace, to embrace new technologies, and it's probably never been a more challenging time to be a small business owner. But with that said, there's great opportunity out there, and there's a lot of satisfaction that those small business owners that have pivoted, that are doing well, and are engaging in some of these new trends. And so we understand that they're the backbone of the economy. We can't locate large facilities if there aren't great service, supply, quality of life, those kinds of small business elements around them. So we try to take that holistic approach and nurture our small businesses.
Next question. Thank you. My next question is for Philip, and I'm not sure what you meant earlier about shore power, but maybe this is it. People talk about solar. What about wind power? We're a coastal state, and is there really a future in that?
Yeah. So, first of all, some of the first wind power that took place in the U.S. on the East Coast and so forth, the skills, the capabilities, the things that we do in Louisiana to support the offshore industry are the same skills and capabilities that can be used for offshore wind production. And that's what's going on. So Lafayette-based Ares Marine, Galliano-based Falcon Global, Metairie-based Keystone Engineering, and Homa-based Global Gulf Island Fabrication. All of those played key roles in that first wind farm that went in place on the East Coast. Now, for Louisiana in particular, there are attractive wind fields that are in the Gulf of Mexico. But at this time, wind is not particularly economic for Louisiana. There's cheaper sources of energy. So, if I were going to take a look at the future and see how this goes, I think we'll see wind continuing to be developed on the East and West Coast. The experience, the skills, and the capabilities we gain from that, I think that the Louisiana partners that are with the offshore industry today will be partaking in that. We need to take advantage of it and lever that. But then as that skills and capabilities, as we become more efficient at producing offshore wind in those areas where it's a bit more attractive, I think that's when it comes to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, of course, we'll have to deal with things like hurricanes and make sure we have robust infrastructure to move that from offshore to our areas where we use the power and so forth. It's coming. It's not economic yet, but I foresee a day when the Gulf of Mexico will be a place where we can utilize wind power as part of our clean energy portfolio.
Thank you. I've wondered a lot because you see a lot of talk about solar and not nearly as much talk about wind power. Greg had a question for you here. You know, when the pandemic first hit, contract workers were kind of the first to go. Do you foresee a problem, you know, when things ramp back up, or we're going to be able to tap that same workforce, or if they dispersed or moved on to other things, or?
A number of our contractors have kept their workforce intact. They've simply moved them to doing some other things. I think they're going to lose some of them, and I don't know how much of it they will lose. The big thing is going to be, you know, will companies now continue to put those investments into those facilities? That's going to be the big one. I know in Lake Charles it's a little different because of the hurricanes you mentioned. We've got a lot of work going on over there with contractors coming in and having to rebuild there. So that kept a lot of them from leaving the state, if you will. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens. We're not sure, one, if they're going to ramp up to the same amount from an investment perspective, and two, if they do for general maintenance, will those people still be available? We're just not sure right now.
Sure. David, kind of the final question, I think, before we go, toss it back to Peter to wrap up. There's been a lot of talk about alternative energy. What role can Louisiana industry play in making fuels from renewable sources, or recycled from products?
I think the state has a lot of opportunities in this clean climate environment. I don't know, in my opinion, I think the readers need to keep in mind that this is going to be an issue that's probably going to be more industry focused than it is power generation focused. As Philip said earlier, from a power generation perspective, and that makes us different than the rest of the United States. So as Peter talked about, as Philip talked about earlier, we have a relatively clean generating fleet already in the state. It's our industrial issues that are going to be the challenge, and the things that I think we need to focus on. Using renewable inputs, green chemistry in the chemical industry are some of those things, looking at carbon capture and storage. Obviously, renewables come into that, renewable fuels is part of that, but I don't see that as being important to us here in Louisiana and meeting those clean climate goals as it is, say, in New England or the Mid-Atlantic or other places. There's going to be a lot. There's no silver bullet. There's more like a shotgun approach. There's going to be a lot of things that we're going to have to consider, but it's going to be things that are more industry oriented than they are power generation oriented. I see the power generation sector as being complementary and helping us move along that path, but it's going to be entirely different from us. And so I think looking at national trends and kind of national buzzwords and national strategies for dealing with climate change, those are all fine and dandy and everything, but I don't know that they have as much applicability to us here in Louisiana as they do in other places.
No, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. This was very informative. When I was a young business writer, I used to go around and meet with people in the various industries to try to figure out what we should be writing about. And so I made a lot of notes from this, and so I appreciate y'all's input. We also want to thank LCMC and Entergy for sponsoring this event, and especially thank our panelists. And I really do look forward to getting back to doing these events live, where we can see each other and have a live audience, and we'll get them catered, I promise, to support the restaurant industry. And and maybe that's where we'll be at this time a year from now. So anyhow, and thanks to all of you who joined us and watched, and we'll be back in some form next year.